was changed in the wanderings of the people by everything that was most impure and seductive in the pagan manners and superstitions. It was one thing in the time of Moses and Aaron, another thing in the time of David and Solomon, and still another thing in the time of Daniel and Philo. So what Pike is saying here is that there was a pure Jewish religion that he believes was centered on some of the same secrets that the Essenes hold to today. But what happened in the history of Israel, the 2,000-year history that precedes John the Baptist, is that intermingling with other cultures brought in impure ideas. And so it was very, very difficult to get to that germ, that original understanding of the revelation that was given first to Moses. And then he goes on. At the time when John the Baptist made his appearance in the desert near the shores of the Dead Sea, this would have been about the time of Jesus, the first century, all the old philosophical and religious systems were approximating toward each other. A general lassitude inclined the minds of all toward the quietude that amalgamation of doctrines for which the expedition of Alexander and the more peaceful occurrences that followed with the establishment in Asia and Africa of many Grecian dynasties and a great number of Grecian colonies had prepared the way. Now that's one of those great 19th century, incredibly convoluted sentences. Basically what he's saying is that by the time of John the Baptist, you know, you've gone through the conquests of Alexander, you've got the Romans. There are so many philosophies that are intermingling with Judaism that the religion itself, the pure kernel of that religion that Moses knew, has been lost. After the intermingling of different nations, which resulted from the wars of Alexander in 3/4 of the globe, the doctrines of Greece and Egypt, of Persia and of India met and intermingled everywhere. All the barriers that had formerly kept the nations apart were thrown down. And while the people of the West readily connected their faith with those of the East, those of the Orient, the East, hastened to learn the traditions of Rome and the legends of Athens. While the philosophers of Greece, all except the disciples of Epicurus, more or less Platonists, seized eagerly upon the beliefs and doctrines of the East, the Jews and Egyptians, before then the most exclusive of all peoples, yielded to that eclecticism which prevailed among their masters, the Greeks and the Romans. Basically, what Pike is saying is that by the time of Jesus, by the time of John the Baptist, Judaism had become completely sullied, you might say, and had lost all sense of its original truth that first came through Moses. And he's suggesting here that the truth that Moses knew also had something to do with the Egyptian mysteries. We're not so much talking about the law that was revealed to him on Mount Sinai. Pike is convinced that Moses, in his early life, learned Egyptian mysteries that were truly at the heart of the Israelite or Jewish tradition. So that's what Pike thought about the Essenes. They were a group of people who were keeping that mysterious kernel of truth alive out in the desert, while in Jerusalem, when the Romans, we know of Pontius Pilate, we know of Herod the Great and Herod's sons, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa, all of those people had completely lost sight of what the true Jewish faith was. And it was the Essenes alone that were keeping this alive. This is what Pike believes. And he knows a lot about the Essenes from his reading of some of the philosophers like Philo of Alexandria, who's pretty obscure. I'm not so sure Philo was even translated into English, by the middle of the 19th century. So if Pike read Philo, he probably read him in Greek, in the original Greek. Josephus, who would have written in Latin, also mentions the Essenes, but there's very, very little that we can know about them. So it's really amazing that Pike knew what he did. Now today, this is the quote broken down that I've just read for you. But today, what we know of the Essenes comes from science, comes from archaeology, comes from history. And what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a little sense of where studies on the Essenes are, especially since about 1945. Pike read Josephus, the Roman historian, Philo of Alexandria. He also got the sense, now this is interesting, he made a connection between Philo of Alexandria and the fact that Philo wrote about Essenes. Philo was a philosopher who understood God in a way that's very similar to what we talked about when we talked about the Kabbalah 2 months or last time we were together. That God was unapproachable light, ineffable, unable to be comprehended by the human mind, yet emanations from God and God's light were present in creation itself. You might remember the emanations, the Sephirot. Well, this is actually a Platonic philosophical idea, but Philo really gave rise to this, and it became part of Judaism. And he suggested that much of the Kabbalistic idea that would later become Kabbalism was present in the early books of Moses. So what Pike does is he takes Philo's theology and he attributes it to the Essenes because Philo wrote about the Essenes. There was another type of philosophy that was present at this time, and it really has its source in Persia, as Pike talked about it. It's something known as Gnosticism. And Pike was convinced that the Essenes were essentially Gnostics. Gnosticism means that purification of the soul comes not by following laws, not by washing hands and all of those things that are so important, the external character, but by gaining a sense of an internal truth, getting in touch with that eternal light, which is God within you. The unfortunate thing about Gnosticism is that it tended to disparage the material world. It tended to think of the material world as evil. And so many of the Gnostic doctrines made this very strong dualism. Things of the spirit were good, things of the world were evil. And so the body comes to be something that is at war with one's soul. We're not really sure that that is what the Essenes believe, but it appears that Pike attribute that kind of philosophy to the Essenes. So now we will have a chance for questions, and I want to make sure that I give you that opportunity. But here's where things get kind of fun. If it hasn't been fun already for you, as I'm sure it has. What do we know about the Essenes? Well, up until 1945, all we could rely upon are these writers who were contemporaneous with them, Philo, Josephus, a guy named Pliny the Elder, but very, very bits and pieces and descriptions. What happened right after World War II, and I'm not sure why archaeological excavations just took off at this time, but they really did. In 1945, there were a group of documents that were found in a place called Nag Hammadi, Egypt, that were original Gnostic Gospels. Now, interestingly, Christianity actually had a branch that believed that Jesus came to bring this secret knowledge that could give them access to the light of God within them, and that this world of the material world was evil, and that they needed to release their soul from this material world and ascend to the light who was originally God, the original light who is God. So that told us a little bit about, this Gnostic philosophy that was very, very, well, it was later deemed as heretical by the church. But it's the same philosophy that Pike attributes, or seems to attribute, to the Essenes. That inner light is the original truth that Moses was revealed to Moses through the Egyptian mysteries and through his, revelation on Mount Sinai. But the important documents for our purposes here is a group of documents known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, the story goes, it's a map of Palestine at the time of Jesus, Jerusalem down here, and then off here to the east, there's this community called Qumran. And outside of Qumran, just to give you an idea where we are, here's Galilee. This is where Jesus of Nazareth would have been from. This is the Transjordan Desert where John the Baptist would have been preaching and baptizing people. Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River descends into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the lowest place on the planet. It is 1,700 or 1,400 feet below sea level. So if you are in the hills of Qumran, you're about 2,000 feet above sea level, but very, very quickly you can descend about 3,000 feet down into the Dead Sea. And it's just a very, very mysterious place. Pure desert, pure desert. In fact, this is kind of what it looks like. In 1947, there was so the story goes, there was a little shepherd boy who was out looking, for his lost goats. And, as kids do, they saw a cave. This is one of the caves. They saw a cave and he started throwing rocks in the cave. And in the middle of doing this, he hears this little clink. And that, really catches his attention. So he climbs up into the cave. And lo and behold, he finds there a number of ceramic jars. These things are about 4 feet tall. And within those jars were a number of scrolls that, when unscrolled, pretty much look like this, Antiquities dealers got a hold of them, and before you know it, we have archaeologists and biblical scholars trying to identify, where did these scrolls come from? Many people believe now that these scrolls were part of the Qumran community, and perhaps the Qumran community, it's still debatable, but most scholars believe that the Qumran community was the center in which the Essenes actually lived. And so now we don't have secondhand accounts of them from Philo. Now we have their actual texts. We have documents that they've actually written, documents that were sacred to them. Trouble is, they're a mess. They're a real mess. This is pretty much what we're working with, right? It's like putting a big jigsaw puzzle together. Some of these documents were scrolled up. They were originally written on something called vellum. Vellum was sheepskin that had been processed and naturally softened so that you could write upon it. And it served. We're not looking at papyrus at this time. Papyrus would have been very, very expensive. Vellum was expensive, but had it been a papyrus, it wouldn't exist today. But because it was vellum, because it was this rather strong fibrous material, these scrolls could be very, very carefully unrolled, some of them, and some of them are fairly well intact. Others of them are basically dust. 25,000 pieces of, and there are many, many scrolls, and they've been found in separate caves around the Dead Sea. But what do you do with those dusty pieces? Well, you catalog every single one of them, right? you indicate what cave it was found in, what scroll it was found on, and you put it all together. And hopefully, and we're talking, at least 50 scrolls that we're talking about here. But how are you going to put all of these pieces together? This is the problem. Well, here's where science comes in. This is wonderful. This is so interesting to me. How do you know that this piece, let's say that the piece this guy is holding in his hand, goes to a particular scroll? You're putting the jigsaw puzzle together, and this is just one little letter in the Hebrew. These scrolls are written in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic. So you can kind of get a sense of, if it's written in Greek, it goes with a Greek scroll. But it's an overwhelming task until science comes in. And what they've done is they've taken DNA samples from these vellum scrolls, and they're able to identify the sheep, the very sheep from which this scroll has come, or this piece has come. So if you can match up all of the genetic sequences to the scroll, then you've kind of eliminated all of the disparity that goes in solving this huge jigsaw puzzle. At least you can put those pieces together because they all have the same genetic sequence. Had genetic sequencing not come along, this would have been an overwhelming project, but now it's moving on apace and continuing. So near where these scrolls were found, archaeologists said, maybe we ought to start looking for a community. We know that the Essenes lived out here in the desert, and lo and behold, very close to where these scrolls were found, excavations took place. And what we have here is the remains, the ruins of an Essene community. In the midst of this community, you'll see here's a cistern, if you can see my cursor. This would have been a place that water purifications would have taken place, very important to the Essenes. So really helpful for us to, now get a sense of who these guys may have been. Now we have a place, now we have their texts, now we can read, some of the peculiar texts that were found with these Essenes. So we're assuming then that this place that was excavated was the Essene community at Qumran. So what did these scrolls have in them? Well, most of them, these Essenes were Jewish, and they believed themselves to be the remnant, the pure, the chosen Jews who had removed themselves from dirty old Jerusalem and all of the problems going on there. And we have the full set of Hebrew Bible texts, but also we have more sectarian texts written in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. We have one which is the manual of the community. Some of you may be familiar with the rule of Saint Benedict. This is how monks are supposed to live in the community. Well, this rule was the rule of this community, and it lays out everything that was expected of the Essenes. They were a group of men. They were celibate. They vegetarian. They were pacifists. This is interesting because I'm going to tell you about a war scroll here pretty soon. They were pacifists. They held all things in common. They, like I said, they did not marry. They went through purification rituals that we might call baptism, right? Baptism by water, and also this idea of baptism by fire. But they also, apart from being real separatists and peaceful, they did not carry weapons. They cared for each other. They held all things in common. If you became an Essene, you gave over all of your private possessions, and the community made a pact, a commitment to take care of you into your elder years. There was great reverence and honor for the elders of the community. Orphans, children were taken into the community and cared for. You can imagine if you're celibate, you're not producing a lot of kids on your own. So probably a pretty good idea to take in some orphans, right? They also very, very strict adherence to the Jewish law. For example, and it's kind of a joke, but it's not a joke. They were so strongly committed to the idea that you do not work on the Sabbath that it was prohibited to go to the bathroom on the Sabbath. That's a pretty strict stuff right there. Who knows what that's all about? But even in the rule, there are places, there's a whole chapter on where you build your latrines, and how you keep yourself purified after all this. But here's the main thing about the Essenes. They were an apocalyptic group. In the period that we're talking about, especially from about 200 BCE all the way up to this time, about the time of Christ, 4 BCE or whatever, the Jews have become so overwhelmed with the idea that they would never, regain the glory of their golden age under David, that the only way that could happen is if God himself were to descend from the heavens and wipe out the Romans and establish a new kingdom on earth. And this is what the Essenes believed. God would send a Messiah, actually two Messiahs. One would be a pure priest. The other would be a king, warrior type. There's even suggestion that there might be a third who was a prophet. God would send a Messiah, and the time was near when God's angels would enter into battle, into conflict with the forces of darkness. The Essenes saw themselves as the sons of light. And of course, Jews and Romans and everybody associated with the temple in Jerusalem were the sons of darkness. And this battle was about to come. What's important there is that the Essenes completely removed themselves from any type of temple worship. Very important, because the second temple was going to be destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. For the Essenes, and this is the connection with Masonry, right? For the Essenes, the temple was an internal idea. The temple was a place where you built up virtue and you cleansed and you purified yourself. You took on discipline and showed your commitment to God through your actions, not by sacrificing some animals, spilling blood. The Essenes didn't sacrifice animals, but it is through an internal commitment that your life becomes purified. So I'm going to conclude here. I know I want to have some time for some comments and questions. But the question itself, now, Albert Pike firmly believed John the Baptist was an Essene. And the question is still open. Was John the Baptist an Essene? Or for that matter, was Jesus of Nazareth an Essene? There is a lot to suggest that John was an Essene. We think about his desert context, eating locusts and honey. I'm not so sure if locusts fit into the vegetarian diet or not. John preached a strict adherence to the Jewish law. His baptism ritual was a ritual of purification, which we know was central to the Essene community. And Jesus, who was believed to have been a follower of John the Baptist, there is much about his ministry that has a lot of Essene features, holding things in common, a focus on healing, a focus on love and commitment to God, and not looking for a warrior type Messiah, but a Messiah who reveals the true nature of what it means to be human. So there are a lot of things to suggest that John may have been an Essene. However, there are some things to suggest that he probably was not. John was an apocalyptic prophet preaching the end of history. Now, that's very much like the Essenes, but that is not the kind of Essene that uh, Albert Pike believed the Essenes to be. Pike believed that the Essenes were looking to rise to that light, original light, which is God, and leave this world behind. There was a sense that there was this immortality of the soul, that you needed to remove yourself from your body and return to the original light. That's a Gnostic idea. That's not what the Essenes were doing. They were apocalyptic. They believed history itself, with all of the material, this material world that was created by God, was going to be renewed. That's not a Gnostic or kind of an esoteric idea. It's really more exoteric. John talked about the resurrection of the body. If the Essenes were, well, I should say, Jesus talked about the resurrection of the body, and if he was, if his ministry was similar to that of John, we can assume that John talked about the same thing as well. If the Essenes were these Gnostics who disparaged the material world, then the last thing they would want to do would be to, come back to life in a resurrected body. So most likely, these Essenes that we're talking about were not Gnostics. There's too much to suggest that even though they thought this world was wicked, it was wickedness as a result of human will not being followed as it should, not following the laws of God. The world could be redeemed. It would happen, of course, through an intervention of God and God's angels. But in the end, the world would continue with a new kingdom. This is not going to be some sort of spiritual life in the heavens someplace. So the question still remains, is John the Baptist an Essene? Pike, for his 19th century context, we've got to hand it to him. The guy was well read, and he made some connections that serve the purposes, I should say, of Masonry. And I don't mean anything about that, but it is good to use John the Baptist and the Essenes as an example of this move towards what we might call an esoteric spiritual tradition. The 17th degree is the first of the philosophical degrees. It is the move from external types of, commitment to laws that are founded in society and in the universe to building the temple within your own heart, moving towards those secrets that are not evident to all. John the Baptist is a good transition person for this. And of course, in the 18th degree, there's a lot of focus on Jesus of Nazareth as well. So I want to leave it there. And for those of you who are interested in some of the research on the Essenes, I'd like to suggest some resources for you. There's a great PBS frontline documentary called From Jesus to Christ. It's about 2 hours long, and it can be found for free online, that talks about the historical context. And John the Baptist is very important in that. There's also an essay on the Essenes that could be found at this website. You can actually move your cursors and go to those right now, I believe. If you're interested in the DNA analysis on the Dead Sea Scrolls, this website here. And if you want to read what Philo of Alexandria said about the Essenes, what Pike would have read and would have attributed to this group, that text is available right here. But there's so much more. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still an enigma to most. And for the next 100 years, people will be reading them and drawing their conclusions and trying to get a sense of what this incredibly complex culture was like, not just the Essenes, but Jewish and Roman culture in the first century. At this point, I think I'll call Don back on, and what we're going to do is we're going to open up questions so that you all can unmute yourselves and ask a question so you don't have to type it in. We thought we'd try it this way this time. I hope this hasn't been too esoteric, speaking of. It's hard to cram into about 40 minutes, but hopefully you've got a few questions. So, for me or for Dan number one, Dr. Dan Wellendorf. Oh, you're number two.
Yeah, Dan Willendorf is number two, and you're number one. And would you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
And I am going to ask everyone to be able to unmute, which means anybody who wishes to ask a question, you're free to just simply turn your mic on, ask a question, and when you finish, turn your mic back off so we don't get into any conflicts. But
back.
If you have a question, turn your mic on and go ahead and ask it. And once we finish with Dan number one, we're going to open up questions to Dan number two, or D squared.
D squared.
Do we have any questions? Anybody having trouble turning their mics on? If you're having difficulty, use the chat box and we can see what kind of questions we have.
Maybe they're all asleep, Don.
You probably put them to sleep. Okay, I've got the from John Williamson. He says, no place to turn on mics. Well, that's interesting. Let me go back and check my settings. Ask all to unmute.
Well, perhaps we'll have to do it through the chat. Please forgive us, everyone. We're still trying to figure out this.
Or use the Q&A.
Yeah. Well, there is one question in the Q&A, it looks like. No? Place to turn on mics. Okay.
Let's see, attendees. I'm checking to see what I can do. Armel has a question.
Okay. That's a good, thanks, Armel. That's a good question. You might know in 66 of the Common Era, this would have been 40 years, 30 years after Jesus' death, the Jews had just upset the Romans so much that the Romans decided they were just going to get rid of them. You know, these darn Jews are just too much. And so the Romans send their legions to Jerusalem, and the Jews hold them off. They stay in Jerusalem, the city, the walled city, for roughly 2 years. And by the time that, you've got your Roman army down there basically living off the land, by the time that Titus, who was the son of Vespasian, the emperor, by the time that Titus and his legions were, able to storm the city, they just destroyed it. The temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. And nothing is left of it now except the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock now stands. But they didn't stop there. The Essenes were next on the list. The Romans were basically hunting down Jews wherever they could find them. This is probably when the Essenes lost most of their community. There's evidence that they persisted on through something called the Bar Kokhba rebellion around 135, but they died out over time. What's important about them, though, is that this desert context in which they lived and the rule by which they lived probably became through word of mouth or through some means, probably became the inspiration for the later monastic communities. First, you had the Desert Fathers, and you had Saint Benedict, who created a rule for monastic living in the desert. A lot of that could be traced back to the Essenes. They certainly do have the model, but it's not clear just what happened to them. They died out certainly after 135. Thanks, Armel.
One thing I was able to do is manually not turn on the mics, but allow the mics for most of the participants. I did get a warning that a couple participants have old versions of Zoom and they cannot be unmuted.
Okay.
So most of the guests here today have the ability to unmute themselves now and talk,
Okay.
if anybody's interested.
Hey, I see my buddy Doyle Dice is here. I haven't seen Doyle in a while. Hello, Doyle.
Hello, Dan. It has been a while.
Yeah.
Very, very good presentation. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. What about questions for Mr. Dan Wellendorf? Feel free to ask those as well, just so we don't have a lot of silence.
Well, D2, nobody wants you.
We're all thinking about how.
A lot of folks may not know me, which is probably it's for the good or for bad. But again, I will have the opportunity to have a lot of fellowship with a lot of our brethren. The folks from Omaha, well known. The folks from Lincoln, there might be a little bit of information, and then in the Hastings and the Alliance Valley, it might be more legend, and sometimes that's not always correct.
Well, just to bring up a point that Dan said that he's having to spend a lot of time getting his, I don't want to say his act in order. I'm going to say he has a lot of work to do to get oriented to his job. And since his training hasn't been available, but he has promised to come back at a future date and allow us an interview. So we can have a little more opportunity to find out what he wants to do. It sounds to me like Dan is really an active guy and looking for things to do. So there's plenty to talk about. One thing I want to bring up, first of all, the last thing I will bring up has to do with next month, but we're modifying the presentations just a little bit because we know that it's intimidating for some people to want to put on a whole hour of presentation or even a half hour in some cases. And so maybe people who do have something to offer do not necessarily feel like they're in a position to want to volunteer to share their knowledge or experience. And so what we're going to do is open up to interviews. So if you have some information you'd like to share, but you don't want to do a full-blown presentation, that's okay. Let me know and we will work out a time where we can add an interview. Maybe we even have 2 interviews and we don't have a full-blown 1-hour presentation. Or if you have a presentation you'd like to make, but you think it's only a half-hour presentation, that's okay, because either we have a short webinar, or maybe we add a second one to it and we have 2 presentations. The one thing I want to also bring up is the presenters don't have to be Masons. If you know of somebody who has a lot of knowledge to share that impacts Masonry, and I gotta say, in my opinion, everything impacts Masonry. If it is a universal science, you can't get away from something that doesn't impact Masonry. But if you know somebody who's not a Mason, but they have something of value to offer, we would invite them to come on. And the last thing is for those people who like to read, If you'd like to do a book review, if you found a book of masonry that you think is particularly good, and you can put it in as a PowerPoint or whatever you'd like to offer, let me know. If you don't know how to reach me, just get a hold of Micah. He's not here tonight, so we'll stick everything on Mike. Mike has been very helpful. He's been very helpful. Lastly, February meeting, we have a speaker. Some of you may know his name is Wahadi Allen. Dan Wellendorf knows him as a very interesting person who's a very big black guy with an experience like crazy. He has a topic called, if I can find it, the nature of man in symbol. And I asked him for a synopsis, but he was busy tonight and he couldn't attend. But essentially it has to do with contemplative masonry. And as Socrates didn't say this, but at the Temple of Delphi, the statement that know thyself is what I think Wahadi is talking about. So I would really encourage people not only to be here next February, but to share it with your Blue Lodges, share it with your friends. We do not restrict this to just Scottish Rite. It's a great recruiting opportunity for both Masonry and the Scottish Rite, so don't lose track of that opportunity. Dan Deffenbaugh and Dan Willendorf, anything you want to offer, or we'll open up the floor to anybody else?
Well, I do want to say that James Marples, I want to thank him for joining us from Texas. We're extending our reach to the world, but he does ask this question about, see now if I can find it. With the Essenes being very few, an early emphasis was on Masons being a few good men. Do you see any correlation with that? Historical correlation, probably not, but symbolic correlation, absolutely. I think Masonry, the few men who set themselves apart and pursue fraternity, liberty, brotherhood, all of those things that are the virtues that are at the center of this organization, and a very small organization now. Hopefully it will not go the way of the Essenes in the future, and that we can continue to keep it alive. But yes, this is a group that is set apart, that does not try to be exclusive of culture the way the Essenes were. They didn't even like going into Jerusalem, but the fact that they held each other accountable through discipline, through spiritual exercises, through a certain rule that they followed, it's no wonder that Pike saw this as a great example for what Masonry can and should be. So thank you for that question. And thanks for joining us both times, James from Texas.
I've got a question. A lot of valleys are having virtual meetings for reasons, of course. And one thing that I've noticed in virtual business meetings is that we have visitors like we have tonight out of state. And so I'm curious to know what you think about the idea of having virtual business meetings and virtual events. In other words, setting up a studio in everybody's valley so you can broadcast your events to those people who either can't get there, or people who are out of state but they're members, or there's a way to keep the activity up and connection with people greater than what we have right now. Any comments on that? Anybody want to turn your mic on?
At this point, Don, I'm still in that process of learning on how electronic communications are permissible or non-permissible. in the Scottish Rite, what actions can be happened. Again, Brother James Cole is, I have not had any formal discussions with him in that regard, as well as the Supreme Council deliberations. I think it's a wonderful thing if used properly. It's kind of like the item up on the agenda with our Grand Lodge this year about electronic devices and the use of lodge.
Mhm.
It was never specified before. There's a brief reference to it in the Book of Ceremonies, but again, how that works in the Nebraska Grand Lodge, I can't tell you until after this particular session. So I'm an advocate for electronic communication, but until I understand the directives of the Supreme Council as your I'll put this into context. Forrest Gump, he had Lieutenant Dan. Right now, you just stuck with Deputy Dan. Not quite sure what I'm doing, but I'm listening and I'm learning.
Gotta love him.
Deputy Dan. This is,
Armel.
yeah,
Hi, Ormel.
Dan, you might be interested in knowing that the Northern Masonic jurisdiction puts on degrees, and they have them available to view on your laptop. Now, I've tried to sit in on them and have called them about that, about getting me in, and they won't let me in. Even though I am a member of the Scottish Rite, they've restricted their degrees to only Northern Masonic jurisdiction folks.
I guess with all of the folks here, I'm not sure how it's going right now. The SGIG in Missouri has a full, they did a online degree last time that is going to be rebroadcast, I believe via Zoom. And it's on the, I don't know the exact day, but I believe it's on the same day the Hastings Lodge of Perfection meeting is at the same time. And the Scottish Rite in Omaha is looking for special permission from Brother Cole as well as the SGIG in Missouri to rebroadcast that in our theater. And it's basically all, it'd be 29 degrees. So I'm not sure how that's going right now, but again, I'm really just learning. So it is a Zoom thing. There is a special invite that is being sent out by Missouri,
Mhm.
but how you get on that list, I'm not sure. You can certainly try to contact the Omaha Scottish Rite office for that information. Right now, I'm using our General Secretary, John Maxwell, to try to work as that conduit. Chuck Cederstrom is still wonderfully involved. He did not leave me out to dry. He's as much interested in the success of the state of Nebraska as I am. So,
Well, you got your work cut out for you, don't you?
you know, Chuck has some wonderfully large shoes to fill, but I'm comfortable with my own. I think he sets the wonderful, wonderful example. And as I mentioned earlier, I love to emulate a lot of those virtues that he's kind of expressed over the years. But again, I'm here to look and listen a lot more than I am to talk. I appreciate the little platform for tonight, and I'll be around possibly in the future. Maybe I can, on a quarterly basis, have 5-10 minutes of the floor. I'll give you an update of what's happening in the state of Nebraska. We get confined to our little valleys so often that we lose the big picture of Nebraska, but I'm here to share that information, and these educations are wonderful. And I'm thankful to be a part of that tonight.
Well, thank you.
One comment, if I might, John Williamson here. I think we met the purpose of tonight of Scottish Rite being the University of Masonry. I learned a lot of things I'd never known before. It's going to take a while to absorb it all and maybe come up with some questions I can send on email in the future. So I certainly thank our presenters and looking forward to next month.
Thank you, John. Yes, do feel free to email me. And I crammed a lot into about 45 minutes. So.
Yes.
But, if you want to look at those links that I put up, or if you'd like me to resend those, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you for your comment.
Well, do we have any other comments? I'm going to start a little background music and you can continue to talk if you like. But the parting glass sounds like a nice way to wind it up tonight. But don't just go away if you've got something you want to say. Well, thank you, Dan Squared. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, happy Robert Burns Day, everyone.
Thanks for another great presentation, guys. Really enjoy these.
Thanks, Phil.
And thank you very much. I enjoyed it from Texas.
Yeah, James, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, James.
Love
Sorry,
it.
I couldn't unmute in time, so I already had a type, so forgive that. So thanks.
Oh, it's okay. We're all forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Dan.
Hey, Charlie.
Keep warm, safe. Very good presentation.
I got to go out and shovel my drive.
So how much snow do you have, Dan?
Well, probably about 6 up here and still doing it.
Yeah, we got about 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a guy down southeast of Lincoln has got 2 feet, so yeah, it's all right. I don't have to get out in it.
Well, I'm north of Lincoln, so I'm better off. So this is where, okay, the glass is almost empty, Dan, but
Uh-oh.
here's to Dan Deffenbaugh, the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I got to fill it up. Got a hole in it. Who is Ron?
I'm Nielsen, probably. I'm going to guess. You know Ron? You need to. He's a good guy.
Careful what you say, Dan. I do want to, Dan, one, and to both of you. This is a fantastic way for distant brethren to gather. Out here in the Hastings Valley, Charles just spoke, and he's in Burwell.
Yeah.
That's 100 miles away.
We've got to get more people linked in.
But yet we can gather, as brothers, whether it be throughout the state or even Texas and whatever. And I think this is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And, I understand the legalities and regulations with regards to meetings, but this is still a way for us to gather for education and whatnot.
Yeah, I think it's great. I hope we, even after the pandemic, I hope we can continue to do it.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes, I believe that the pandemic has caused us to expand our horizons, and this will be one of those things that I hope sticks around.
Yeah, I do too. I think you're absolutely right. It's,
Well,
necessity is the mother of invention. And
in addition to putting a camera in the lodge room during meetings, we thought about putting a camera in the bar afterward and putting a Zoom video up on the big screen so anybody who's not local can enjoy fellowship just around a group, if nothing else. Anyway, there's got to be things we can do. And then the forums, we'll see how those go, but they're not ready yet. They're not cooked yet.
Thank you, everyone. Doyle, we're gonna have to catch up. Haven't seen you in a while, so I'm gonna be on my way.
Doyle, where are you from?
I'm from Hastings.
Okay. And
Yeah.
Charles, where are you from? Charles
Charles Haskell, he's from Ord.
Or
Earl,
No, he's from
No,
Burwell.
Burwell, sorry.
Burwell.
you know, I talked to somebody.
just go to Ord once in a while, Dan.
Hey, got a
Dan, just
question for you guys. What do you think about having a forum where we all sit around and talk about how to fix the problems with our buildings and our membership?
Buildings and what? Don?
Membership.
Yeah.
Lodges that are getting too small, lodges that you can't get people into. Anybody got any solutions you want to share? You do this in a forum, not tonight, but
Right.
I got into a group of people from, I think maybe Burwell and Alliance at the Grand Lodge. And of course, you have to sit in a bar to do this. You can't do this without a glass of wine or beer. And we kicked around all kinds of ideas on how to deal with membership and how to deal with buildings that couldn't afford elevators and they had stairs too high for people to climb, you know.
Right.
It just seemed like a great way for people to share ideas and how to solve problems. Anyway,
It is a great problem, and it not only, we don't have the people here. I belong to Burwell, and I'm putting in for a dual membership into Seneca Lodge, which is in Thedford. That's where we belong to Eastern Star. They work with Hyannis Lodge, Zion 134, I believe. And we're all struggling, and I don't think consolidation is the answer. It doesn't seem to work. My question is what are we as Masons not doing for our new candidates, our new people? Are we dropping the ball on mentoring them? And I don't know. I really don't. I'm getting too old to try to figure it out, but it really concerns me.
well, I'm a Scottish Rite evangelist to Blue Lodges around the area, and I asked them about how they mentor, and they kind of look at me like, well, I don't know, what do you mean by that? So I asked them about the books, and until recently, lodges didn't even ask people to read those books the Grand Lodge puts out. But I think everybody realizes that a lot of lodges bring people in and then they just drop them. You know, you're a Mason now. And I think we have to keep them active and give them a job to do. And I'm not seeing all the lodges doing that. And that's why I'd like to use more of the Scottish Rite Masonic education and bring it down to the Blue Lodge level to let them know there's something else than just you've been through 3 degrees, now you're done, you know? Ask them simple questions like, what does it mean that you had to be freeborn? What does it mean that you took one upright regular step with your left foot with your body erect to worship the Mass in the East? What is the symbolism of that? Nobody ever teaches that kind of thing, but it makes them think there's more to Masonry than just, well, I finished my 3 degrees. But, you know, that's me. I'm just a caveman.
Just a caveman. I haven't heard that.
I'm not familiar with your modern ways.
I feel bad about getting a new candidate in and getting him through, which has taken a lot of time up in our area here, but we're not mentoring them. And if we do give them a job, it is for a fundraiser rather than a fun socializing thing. Fundraisers are fun, they're nice, but after the same 4 or 5 guys keep doing it, and that's the only reason they're there is for a fundraiser to keep the doors open. I wonder where we're missing I think we're missing the game somewhere.
Years
Yeah.
ago, when I was master of my Blue Lodge, and a couple years after, when I had time, I developed a database of Masonic education that was keyed to first degree, second degree, third degree, and then after the third degree. And every week I would send out an email with something that was related to each individual candidate's progress in Masonry. And so every week they got a little bit of something. And all the guys who went through that when I was doing it really thought it was very special. I think Tom Howder was even signed into that email list that I had. And he was even using some of my stuff in the Grand Lodge email, Masonic education. But it's that kind of touch me, give me something, give me something. It really works. And I would give this database to anybody who wants it, but you know, it takes somebody to do it. And when I did it for about 3 or 4 years, I ended up getting too busy with other work and I couldn't continue. But I'm going to get back to it probably this year, finally, after I got some things settled. But I do know from experience that this touching people with something every week always kept them thinking. And but you got to have the stuff, and you got to have somebody to do it. So that's always a problem. But you guys are been around.
As most of you know, I also belong to the Shrine, and at Grand Lodge several years ago, immediate past Grand Master, who will remain not nameless, asked me if I thought that Shrine would ever drop the requirements of being a Mason. And boy, I bit my tongue and I tried to look the other way and I wanted to run. But finally I told him, I said, yes. And he said, why? I said, well, we are probably going to continue to take care of the kids in the hospital, but I still don't like it. I still like the Blue Lodge, and I really think something needs to be done about it, and I do not know the answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to turn off recording.